The Effects Beebo is a rather ambitious project built largely by one person based out of Melbourne, Australia. And it was already pretty powerful when it was released earlier this year, but just a few weeks ago, Effects merged the Beebo firmware with its other modular pedal, the Digit, basically creating one super pedal. Now the Digit handled things like guitar-based effects, amp simulations, cab simulations, reverbs, whereas Beebo focused on synthesis and weird stuff. And now you can get all of that in one box. The Effects Beebo is basically a virtual modular synthesizer in a guitar pedal format. Now that makes comparisons to the Empress Effects Zoya basically unavoidable. The most obvious difference between the two is the interface, whereas the Zoya has a grid of 40 buttons, the Effects has this 5-inch touch screen. And while it's definitely on the small side and you have to do a lot of delicate pecking, it's pretty easy to navigate. All right, let's start with the hardware though. On the outside, the Effects Beebo isn't anything super interesting from the front other than the touchscreen. And I won't lie, I'm still not 100% convinced that a 5-inch touchscreen is going to stand up to the rigors of a pedal board, but it seems like it's pretty hard to stomp on it. The buttons, the foot switches, and the endless encoders make it pretty hard to get your foot in there without really trying. Around back, you've got 2 audio ins, 2 audio outs, USB for doing firmware updates and loading custom impulse responses or IRs to use with the cabinet simulators, and reverb. But unfortunately, the USB cannot be used for a MIDI host. Instead, you've got 2 TRS mini MIDI jacks in and out. Effects is kind enough to throw a pair of adapters in the box though. These audio ins and outs are kind of interesting though, because instead of being TS style mono ins and outs, they are TRS, meaning that each one of these is actually 2 channels. So in reality, you have 4 audio ins and 4 audio outs. Now this is notable because A, it gives you more audio channels to work with so that you could do things like build external effects loops or run parallel effects chains on different instruments through different channels. But it is worth noting that most instruments and mixers use mono style TS jacks, so you'll need either an adapter or have to use channels 1 and 3 in mono mode to make the most of this in stereo. My one big complaint about this physically is these endless encoders. They have next to no resistance and they feel a little bit cheap, which is kind of a shame because the rest of the package feels really good. So the Beebo is pretty easy to wrap your head around from an interface perspective. If you can use a smartphone, you can use the Beebo. Everything basically is done on the 5-inch touch screen. If you want to connect 2 modules, you press and hold one, press where you want to connect it to, and now you've got an audio through. Audio is passed through. If there's more than one option for where to connect it, it'll pop up a menu for you to choose. If you want to add a module, you simply touch the tiny plus icon at the bottom, and then everything is broken down into categories, effects, inputs, outputs, controls, and synthesis/weird. So if you want to add a delay, you open up effects, you go down to delay, and it adds it in there. And again, just simply touch, and touch, touch, and touch. You have a delay. If you want to change the parameters on something, you tap the module and it opens up to a bunch of simple sliders where you can change things. Some of the modules though do have some pretty fancy graphics, and it's coming to a lot more of them. For instance, there's a bunch of ports of Mutable Instruments Eurorack stuff. For those who aren't familiar, Mutable Instruments is a very big name in modular synthesis, but all of their modules are open source. So people are free to take those things and port them wherever they want. A lot of the oscillators have made their way onto the Arturia's Microfreak, and you'll find a bunch of their stuff on here. So here's the macro oscillator, which is essentially Mutable Instruments plates. And you can see you've got like nice little icons showing you what the oscillators are. So, and this is a big thing about the Beebo is it's a synthesizer too. It's not just a guitar pedal. It is truly a modular synthesizer in a pedal format. So let's turn on hold and ARP, and here we go. And then you can go in and actually modulate stuff and change things. I don't promise that this is going to sound good. So we've got 4 different oscillators all being triggered in succession. So you'll see that some of the modules have pretty elaborate graphics, but most are just simple sliders. Some of them you can enter parameters with an on-screen number pad, but unfortunately, that's only for a few things. I really wish PolyEffects would expand that to all parameters across the entire pedal in all modules. My other complaint interface-wise is a lack of visual feedback when you're using other modules to control other modules. So if you connect an LFO to the delay time on a delay, even though the time on the delay is changing, you won't see that on screen. But obviously, the most important part is what's inside, the software. And despite a few warts, it's largely a success. Sure, the UI can be slow to respond sometimes, and yes, it's a little bit easier to chew through the DSP's power and max out the CPU than you might expect. But all of the modules are pretty useful and pretty easy to navigate, and they all sound really good. There are 97 of them, according to PolyEffects, covering everything from simple VCAs to amp emulations to ports of Mutable Instruments Eurorack modules. Honestly though, I found myself less drawn to the synthesizer side of the Beebo and much more to its guitar-based effects, amp simulators, cab simulators, and reverbs. As great as it is to have Mutable Instruments plates in a guitar pedal format, I gotta say, I'm much happier about Clouds being in here. Clouds is a granular texture synthesizer. In short, it chops up incoming audio in real time and spits it back out as an almost unrecognizable mass. Until now, if you wanted to get something like that on your pedal board, you'd have to put something extremely fragile like a Eurorack case on there. So what I've got set up here is a pretty basic patch with my guitar coming in through a amp simulator and a cab simulator, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and then split my signal into Clouds and Dry. And these two foot switches are controlling those channels. So right now, there's going to be nothing coming through. Both are muted. This should be dry. And this is just the built-in cab simulators and the built-in amp simulators. And then once we add Clouds to the mix, we just get these really nice ambient washes. Mutable Instruments module that I really love that's in here is Grids. And Grids is sort of an automatic drum sequencer. Basically, you map out a location on an XY axis and it spits out a pattern of hi-hats, snares, and bass drums. Now, obviously, you can use that to create drum patterns, but what I found is really fun is using it to modulate things like delays to create rhythmic patterns by controlling its variables. I had a whole patch set up on here ready to demo that. Basically running a synth arpeggio through this complex patch that triggered delays in a rhythmic way using grids. Unfortunately, it has crashed the pedal twice now in attempting to load it up for this demo, so we're going to move on. But it seems like a good moment to pause quickly to talk about one of the downsides of the Beebo, which is it still can be pretty buggy. PolyEffects updates this thing constantly. I believe they said they issued 50 firmware updates in 2020 alone, and let me be clear, that's great. I wish more companies would be as proactive about improving their products, squashing bugs, etc. But it does feel like a little bit of a bummer sometimes that those bug fixes feel necessary. One of the good things, though, about all of these modules is that they play nice with the internal CV or control voltage controls. So for example here, I've got a pretty basic patch setup where foot switch A is tap tempo, controlling an LFO, going into a pan control. So basically all the pan is doing is sending my signal between two different delays. That foot switch, that tap tempo is setting the tempo for one delay and then going into a ratio module, dividing the delay to set up dotted eighth notes for the other one. So basically, my signal is going through two different rhythmic delays in an alternating way, creating a pattern. And then, of course, as mentioned, using the built-in amp simulator and the built-in cab simulator. I'm using that for basically all the guitar stuff. None of the tone is going through an external amp. Everything is coming from the pedal itself. So as you can hear, the signal is it's switching back and forth. You can hear it transitioning between the two different timed delays. Just creating this basic pattern. Something like this, obviously, if you play chords, becomes chaos. But, you know, for single notes, you get this interesting rhythmic interplay. Now, you don't have to keep something like this to reverb, to delay, however. You can do more complex and bizarre patches with it. We've got an LFO controlling a pan module, feeding my signal to two different effects units. One is a pretty basic chorus, and the other one is a time stretching module, which is another mutable instruments port. And it creates these weird cascades, and you can hear it as it switches back and forth. Perhaps the thing I used the most, though, were the amp simulators, the cab simulators, and the convolution reverb modules. Between those and the cab simulators, though, the Beebo makes a pretty solid DI or direct input box. In fact, everything you've heard me play is coming through the Beebo. No external amp, just the built-in simulations. So there's two different power amp simulators. I find, honestly, it's a little bit helpful to add a EQ before that. And then we've got the cab simulators, and the cab simulators and the reverbs are impulse response based, meaning it just uses an audio recording to simulate those things. The Beebo comes preloaded with a whole bunch of IRs for bass, guitar, and other things, or you can actually go online and find some for free or buy them if you want. But there's a bunch of pretty classic ones in here. I'm a big fan of the Fender Bassman through the Neumann UI87. So the Beebo comes preloaded with a bunch of impulse responses for classic digital and analog reverb units, as well as real spaces, like the London Palladium and the Pool of the Black Star up in Manitoba, I believe, which is really excellent. But my favorite thing, and I think the thing that makes the reverb very fun, is that you can load any sound you want in and create a reverb out of that. Or ham radio, which gets this really great granular kind of sound. And then you can even use drums to get basically rhythmic delays. So a little Al Green. This one actually works pretty well with chords because you can just do. And that's really the real strength and joy of the Beebo. It's the ability to experiment and do things that you just couldn't do in real life, at least not without thousands of dollars worth of gear. The one glaring hole is the lack of a looper. Now there is a looping delay, but it's pretty bare bones. PolyFX is working on a pretty robust looking multi-loop module, but there's no word on exactly when that's gonna land yet. But let's get to the question that's on all of your minds. Should you buy the Beebo or the Zoya? And the answer is both, question mark. This might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but even though they're very similar in concept, the execution and feature list is different enough that it's not an either-or scenario. I found myself using the Beebo a lot differently than I do the Zoya. With Empress Effects modular pedal, I generally load a few new presets every month or two, and I design a new patch about as often. With the Beebo, I'm more likely to start from scratch every time. And now, I get it, they're expensive. So if you have to choose, here's what I'm gonna say. If you want the world's most powerful multi-effects pedal with an insanely active community of users building new presets every day, go with the Zoya. There's almost 900 patches on patchstorage.com. The reverb algorithms are second to none, and it excels as an experimental looper. Zoya is a perfect end-of-chain, do-it-all pedal, and it would 100% be on my desert island list. But if you're more interested in exploring the modular side of things and plan to constantly tweak and customize patches, go with the Beebo. Its interface is just much more conducive to on-the-fly rewiring. It basically can replace your amp. The IR-based reverbs are a source of endless fun, and the ports of mutable instruments modules are among the most unique things you can find in a guitar pedal right now. And look, the Beebo isn't perfect. It can be buggy, and even though the interface is intuitive, it's still a very complex device. But it's wholly unique, unbelievably powerful, and for the relentless sonic experimenter, its draw is going to be undeniable.